Welcome to W Report. This is an analytical transformation of an interview. The Alaska summit sparked everything from panic to praise. Some feared Trump was setting a trap for Putin. Others feared the opposite. Europe swung between cheering and warning him. In your view, what did this meeting actually show? How do you assess it?
So the meeting is highly fascinating to me. I mean, the whole process, how we got to the meeting, because it came out of the blue, at least for me, because we first had Donald Trump coming into office, and I also had talks with Russian scholars, and they told me, look, the name of the game at the moment is expectation management in Russia, because Trump has been saying all of these things about wanting to wind down the war in Ukraine, and it would never have happened under him, and he will make peace in one day. And a lot of the things, including acknowledging that this is a proxy war, were things that were important to the Russians. But again, they understand very well, especially Vladimir Putin, that it's not a one-man show in the United States, right? Vladimir Putin several times made the point that he had good relationships with several U.S. presidents, and once they go back to Washington, or once everybody is home, then suddenly the policy changes again, right? So I think the Russians understand very well that the United States is a very complex political process, but still there was hope that you could turn things around. And I think actually in the last 6 months, together the Russians and the Americans actually did turn things considerably around when you consider where we were a year ago, toward de-escalation, actually, even if we haven't gotten to a proper peace agreement also with Ukraine. And you could see how the Europeans are actually freaking out over the prospects of the conflict winding down, which is the weirdest thing of all. But it is one of these realities in which the satellite states are more hawkish than the actual central power, right? They've just internalized all of these dogmas, these transatlantic dogmas, so deeply that it takes them years to catch up with the latest developments in the center. And now we've seen that the center itself, it oscillates. Washington oscillated, then Trump oscillated between trying to have phone calls, have diplomacy with the Russians, and then on the other hand, again, play to the neocons and play to the faction in the US that still believes that more weapons and more support for Ukraine is the way to go. But they hit a brick wall, right? I mean, it's just Russia is not only winning, Russia basically has won, and Orban said so 2 days ago, that this is over. The war is basically done. Ukraine has lost. The question is, what are the terms of the surrender document, and how is that going to unfold? And on the one hand, I think we are seeing the negotiations for that, this surrender negotiation, not surrender, but the ways of ending the war, because one party has just cannot continue fighting. At least we're seeing it, how the Ukrainians are crumbling. Trump wants a way out, but the Russians, I think the Russians actually at this point, they are looking at a way to structure what's coming next. So that's how I understand it. That's how I also understand that they didn't come in this summit meeting. They don't have an agreement on anything, right? That's not true. Sorry. They have an agreement, and I think it was written in the back of the summit meeting, that they want to pursue peace. And I think it's very important, this slogan, pursuing peace. It's not making peace. It's not the thing is not let's have a treaty or something. The point is to have a process that then in the end will lead to a better structure. And this is what the Russians are all about, right? Root causes of the war, and a security structure that they want to create, not just with Ukraine. Ukraine is just one piece in the puzzle. But an understanding with the Americans of how to create a common security architecture that somehow then which will take into considerations the security concerns of Russia. And Vladimir Putin in his speech about the summit said so much, right? He said that this is what they want to achieve, and that he also thanks Donald Trump for listening to that and trying to understand the root causes, right, of this conflict. And Donald Trump to me looked very downbeat after the summit, and I think he didn't really know what to say. He was rambling a lot about much ado about nothing. Like, he was naming his staff and so on, and thanking them for being great and wonderful, while Vladimir Putin lined out a very, very concise speech of what is important to Russia, and how much the Russians also appreciate the US. His speech was so much about appreciation of the United States, all while accepting that they are even locked in a hot war down in Ukraine. So to me, this was most fascinating from the side of the Russians, of how they seem to now accept and incorporate that we live in a new reality, in which at the same time you have military confrontation while also having diplomatic engagement with the other one, and that they got to this point where they even can meet, then is to them a great step forward, even though Vladimir Putin explicitly says this is just the first step. So he expects more steps, and at the end of the meeting, he invited Trump to Moscow, right? It's a very smart thing to do, and of course, doing that also in English, and putting the spot on Trump, and signaling all of this kind of praise, which, by the way, the Western media is not reporting on. CNN, BBC, New York Times, they only report on what Trump said, and then a few here and there, like Vladimir Putin quotes, but they never reflect on like just how much Putin actually praised the United States, which I think would change quite a bit of how we also understand the Russians in the West. But this is, of course, never done. So overall, I interpret this as being quite a significant summit, in the sense that it kind of changes how these two great powers now interact with each other. And my greatest concern is that the United States is still not sure about what it does and what it wants. And I think Donald Trump wanted a short-term victory, like wanted to sell something to the Russians. I mean, he said, like, there's no deal until there's a deal. So in his mind, there's no deal done. But I think to the Russians, like, since they interpret this more as part of a process, I think they interpret it as something that is useful, which is why they went there, right? And which is why this very big delegation and very high-powered delegation went to the United States. And it's also a trust-building measure, actually, for the Russians to say, like, sure, we trust you enough to go to Alaska. And in the end, everything went well, right? They actually had exactly the meeting they wanted to have. And this is actually a very hopeful meeting to me. And I think one in which also the United States now is, through which the United States is also trying to to understand how the multipolar world will work. It's not anymore top down. It's actual proper. You have now peers. You have equals. For the longest time, the U.S. foreign policy has been conducted in a way that doesn't really recognize peers, and I think we now have that.
Pascale Lotus sees Alaska as the start of the end of U.S. dominance. Russia didn't come for a quick deal. It came to launch a long-term security framework, with Ukraine as just one piece of the puzzle. Europe is panicking, afraid not of war, but of it ending. The United States is confused. Trump wants a win, but has no plan. Russia now treats the United States not as a master, but as an equal. That's why Alaska happened. Western media keeps portraying Putin as irrational and aggressive, someone who only understands force. Yet in Alaska, he spoke of respect, cooperation, even brought economic leaders with him. If this war is just about territory, why all this? Isn't it about something far deeper? And why meet in Alaska, not Europe, but right on their shared border?
Yeah, and Vladimir Putin opened his speech by saying, like, I came here to the closest place between us, where we are neighbors. And when I landed, I said, "Hello, good to see you again, neighbor. Nice that you're still alive." Something to that extent. I mean, he appreciated being a neighbor to the U.S. and really wanted also to shift to that perception. Right? We are not fighting so much over Europe as that we have to figure out our bilateral ties. And let's be clear, we are much closer to each other than we think. We don't have the Europeans between us. this is also a very smart thing from the Russian side, right? Because that's the one thing they also agree with the Americans. Like, you have to take the Europeans out of the picture, because this is among great powers, and this is among rekindling their relationship. And downstream, if you rekindle this relationship, you will get to a better position also downstream. And Europe is at this point downstream. The Europeans made themselves completely, utterly dependent on the US to a degree that we haven't seen in history. We just don't have an example for this level of subservience and just dependence on a foreign power. And therefore, now the logical thing for the Russians to do, and for the Americans now as well, is to actually start with mending the bilateral ties and figuring then out again in the process how they push this downward. And of course, at the lowest end, or at the most dramatic end, you have the actual fighting in Ukraine. And it is an unequal fight, because on the one hand, you have the US proxy Ukraine fighting with Ukrainian men and women, Ukrainian blood, against Russians. So the Russians bleed directly, whereas the US doesn't. But it is part of the reality of how the US has learned to fight very, very efficiently, right? Not only proxy wars, but I call them implementation wars. Now, again, from a Russian perspective, they said from the beginning, this is between us and the United States on the structural level, and they try to mend that. And I think the Russians actually interpret the current moment as one where there's a window of opportunity to change tracks. And I know some people disagree, like very importantly, Brian Berletic, and you had him on your show, and he makes the pessimistic case for this being all basically just a ruse, and this is just reload, withdraw a little bit, reload, and play for time, and then attack again once the Russians are once enough force has been built up. And we cannot exclude this as being a possibility, but we see, at least from the Russian side, that they, after all their experiences, they still judge the current moment as one that can be used, that is an opportunity, and they try to push it forward. And I do think this process will continue. The Americans are probably disappointed now that they don't have anything very concrete. But on the other hand, I think there was expectation that you would get further, because you did have these delegations. And I think it was probably, there would have been more meetings had they found more common ground. Apparently they didn't, although a 3-hour meeting is already quite a substantial summit, but they didn't get as far as they wanted. But they finally had this talk among the top leadership, and again, it also includes Lavrov, it also includes Rubio, it includes Witkov that participated. And now the question is, how can they continue this push forward, because the ball is now actually in the court of the United States, right? That has to talk to the Europeans and to NATO, and Trump said as much as that. So I suppose that there were discussions of the next high level kind of structural framework steps that can be taken, not an implementation, not what you can do on the ground, but how to get to more potential for de-escalation, as little as that. Because again, like, the Russians now made it very clear that they will not give a ceasefire. They will do both military track and diplomatic track at the same time, which is of course exactly what the Europeans want to shut down. But they have nothing, and the United States at this point seems to be willing to say, like, fine, then let's do it this way.
After Alaska, it feels like the United States and Russia might build relations outside of Europe, where everything seems stuck. But doesn't this also suggest the West wants to split Russia, cooperate in the East, but contain through Europe? If so, can we even speak of a new trust-based model?
No, absolutely right. And the strength of Barletic's argument is that he takes the long view, and he has a lot of evidence on his side, for even the physical reset button with Hillary Clinton and so on. I mean, how the US has been doing this time and again. But the one thing is that the US, even much more than Russia, is this very fractured kind of decision-making process, and you have these proper factions, and we know them. I mean, it would be wrong to argue that people like Jack Matlock and the other like Russian specialists and Soviet specialists, that they were just hidden neocon hawks who actually always wanted this outcome. No, we know Jack Matlock and what's his name, the great George Kennan. These people, they were very important. They were very influential, and to some extent still are. The Jack Matlock is still around, and he's still an icon of that era. And they were pushing for better relationship with Russia, and they said in the 1990s, we should not expand NATO. This will lead to conflict. This faction within the US simply lost the argument. Now they keep, unfortunately, the restrainers. Ever since 45, they kept losing the argument time and again. And I make that argument a lot to say that, in the 1930s, the restrainers had the United States. And today, the restrainers are called isolationists. They weren't. They were neutralists. They said we have to keep the US neutral. They lost this decisively in 41 and 45. They never managed to restrain the United States again. You had these debates. Even MacArthur in Japan, said Japan should be neutral. So you and then you had other people with other visions that were way more expansionist and militarist, and they want the basis. And then you have what Jeffrey Sachs tells us about the people who think about the world like Brzezinski, like a goddamn video game, right? And that faction kept winning the internal debate. Now the question is, will that continue, right? And if Berletic is right, then they will keep winning, and currently we are just seeing a phase, right? But there is the option, or there is the possibility that we are seeing a genuine change within the power balance of inside the United States, of which faction wins over the other one, of how foreign policy should be done. And if we are optimistic about it, then we would say that, well, now we are at the beginning of a genuine change over there. Therefore, the multipolar balance of power is probably arising also within the US, and that change of hearts is now taking place. There's no way for us to tell. Only history will be able to teach us that. But I think we must not underestimate the factor of the real ideological power struggle also within the US. I think for Russia, there's also something similar going on. I mean, you have Karaganov and so on, but at the end of the day, they more play into the same foreign policy goals more than the US, at least how I see it.
Russia and the United States are nearly in direct conflict, yet they're still talking about the future. Why is Russia open to dialogue if it doesn't trust the West? In the past, treaties were signed, then discarded overnight. What makes this any different? Why wouldn't this be just another deception, unless there are real guarantees?
Yeah, and it's like there's two levels of deception possible. One is the known deception, where the Trump administration like secretly says, "Ha ha ha, let's fool the Russians," the way that they said they did with Iran. Although even with Iran, there's still the question: was that real, or did they just post facto manufacture that after the Israelis pushed them into striking Iran? We can't answer it for sure. But so one level of deception is like ha ha ha. The other level is, of course, the institutional deception, where like the Trump administration actually has genuine wish of winding this down, but the deep state and the way the US works, as a political system with every 4 years elections, and then he's going to lose the parliament. I mean, Capitol Hill, the Congress in the next in next year. That then this process will push toward this being a empty promise, or being an empty shell, right? And these are two different levels of deception. But overall, in the long run, from the outside perspective, it will be the same. It will be the US pretending that they want better relations, pretending to make a deal with Iran 2016, right, JCPOA, and then tearing up the agreement 2.5, 3 years later, that kind of not sticking to your word. And both of them make the US very unreliable. But I do think the Russians by now have understood that the US is not reliable when it comes to promises, right? Because they've tried too many times. They've had good intentions too many times, also in the Security Council with Libya, right? Okay, fine, let's not veto a no-fly zone. And then what does NATO do? It goddamn takes out Libya for good. And they don't fall for that anymore. So the difference now is that they do both. They do the military hard power arm while not shutting the door on diplomacy. So we are in a sense back to a 19th century Clausewitzian world where war is the continuation of diplomacy by other means, and diplomacy is the continuation of war by other means, and you pursue both at the same time. And I do think Russia is relatively comfortable in that, not comfortable, I'm sorry, like Russia has come to the conclusion that this is what it is, and this is what they have to do, and they are able to play that game. And the Americans are still in this make-believe dream world that they also have to do to tell us, the general population, that we're the good guys, where the United States is the mediator, the United States is the peace bringer, and it's the it's just an in between power, right? When we still are in this make believe world, but slowly but surely even the West are forced to recognize that this is not the reality. And the question is, how long will it take until also in the West we have a more realistic appreciation of what we are actually in? And you can see how our media is still trying to make us believe this fairy tale stupidity of the new Hitler sitting in Moscow and in Gaza, actually, right? And the white knights having to save the day. But it's crumbling. Luckily, it's crumbling.
Europe is exposed as irrelevant. Its panic stems from a deeper fear that the war might end without them. The United States remains fundamentally untrustworthy. Too many broken promises, from Iran to Libya, make Russia adopt a 19th century model, negotiate and fight at the same time. The United States still sells itself as the peacekeeper. Russia already knows. In today's world, you must negotiate with one hand and strike with the other. Can there be peace when one side is fighting a real war and the other is pretending it's still in charge? Thanks for watching. Support the channel if you find this format valuable. More deep dives are coming soon. Until then, think for yourself and draw your own conclusions.